Japan has reinforced crews working to find survivors of the devastating New Year's Day earthquakes. The confirmed death toll has risen to 84, with at least 79 more unaccounted for. Rescuers are still struggling to reach some of the worst hit areas.
Sniffing out survivors. Rescue dogs and military personnel are racing against the clock to find anyone alive under the rubble. These desperate attempts are made even more difficult by continuing aftershocks, destroyed roads, and the remote location of the worst-hit areas. In a final push, Japan's Prime Minister has doubled the number of rescue workers in the area.
The
situation in the affected area is very challenging. But from the perspective of saving lives, we're making all efforts to rescue and to provide life-saving aid to as many people as possible before the crucial 72-hour period following the disaster elapses this evening.
Volunteers handed out free food to the people whose homes were destroyed in the quake. Thousands were left without electricity or water.
There's no running water for the toilet and we can't wash our hands. There are babies in the evacuation center, and my biggest worry is that they'll get infected with COVID or influenza, and that illness will spread.
Some have returned home in the hopes of receiving news about missing relatives, only to find their entire neighborhood razed to the ground. Even when the aftershocks stop and the dust settles, the reality here is that tens of thousands of people will be left homeless and without vital services as the region starts the long and painful rebuilding.
DW correspondent James Chada joins us now from the city of Wajiyama on Japan's west coast. What is the situation where you are?
Well, we're here at Wajima now, which is on the northern coast of the Noto peninsula. This is the worst affected area. Right now, we're outside the municipal hospital here. We arrived here about an hour ago. And in the hour that we've been here, we've seen an elderly man be transported into the hospital. We understand he was recently recovered from remains in the hospital. We actually just spoke with the manager of the hospital here as well, who didn't let us film inside, but he was telling us some of the harrowing details that are coming out from people, that people are still being found today, that some people are being brought in. They're having to have limbs amputated because they've been crushed under buildings for so long. So really, in this discussion with the manager, we really learned some really kind of troubling details about what the survivors of this earthquake are still facing in this part of Japan.
And how high are the hopes of finding more survivors at this stage?
Well, now we've passed the 72-hour mark since the earthquake struck, and regardless of where an earthquake takes place, this is the point after which finding survivors becomes increasingly more difficult. That has been made even more problematic and more troubling and more difficult because of the problems with access. I mean, we drove up to Wajima from a city further in the south of Japan today. It was a journey that's meant to take about an hour and a half. It took about 7 hours. And we encountered some of the emergency response vehicles that have been drafted in from other parts of Japan on the way. Sometimes those emergency vehicles are allowed to pass through special lanes to get to the affected areas faster, but then often we would encounter them just further up the road. So it gives you some sense, just because there are landslides that have taken out a lot of key arterial roads, and that's making it really difficult for anyone to get supplies in. We were also at a supermarket earlier on across the city where they were having to ration supplies for residents of Wajima because it's still so difficult to get anything up here.
James, just briefly, Japan has always prided itself for being quake resilient. Does this earthquake shake that image?
Yeah, I think this earthquake has brought together a confluence of really difficult factors. Japan does pride itself on being a country that deals with earthquakes very well. But what's happened here is that you have a really remote region. You have only a few arterial roads to get to this region, which have been blocked off by the earthquake. And then another factor, when you compare it to previous earthquakes, like the 2011 earthquake, which devastated much of the eastern part of Japan and led to tens of thousands of deaths, the difference here was that you had the epicenter much closer to the mainland. Where we are right now, it's mostly the older buildings that don't have the earthquake-proof infrastructure that have been destroyed. But it is a difficult recovery effort ongoing here.
DW's James Chatta joining us from Wajima in Japan. Thank you.